Picture a German tank crew sitting stunned in the smoke after a hit. Their vehicle is wrecked, the battlefield is still hot, and across the churned-up ground they spot British tankers climbing out of Shermans. Now here's the part that stuck in German memories. Those British crews weren't acting like men who just survived a tank fight. They weren't fist-pumping. They weren't yelling. They weren't scrambling like they expected the next round any second. Instead, they moved with this stiff, controlled calm, straightening gear, checking their dress, adjusting headwear like they were about to be inspected. German veterans later described it as more insulting than scary. Not because it was magic or superhuman, but because it felt like the British were saying, without words, this war doesn't get to mess up who we are. And the unit that kept triggering that reaction again and again was the Guards Armored Division. Before we get into the fights, hit the quick subscribe so you don't lose the next part, because the moment this turns from annoying to we genuinely can't stand these guys happens fast. Here's the key idea. German troops didn't end up hating the Guards just because of tactics. It wasn't like the Guards had some secret tank or a special gun no one else had. Most of the time, they were rolling in the same basic American-built Shermans other British units used, with the usual mix of upgrades and supporting gear. What made it personal was the attitude, the vibe they carried into battle, a bone-deep confidence, old-school tradition, and a kind of icy self-control that German soldiers read as arrogance. Wait, these are the tankers. In the early summer of 1944, Normandy was a mess. The Allies were pushing inland from the beaches, German units were trying to plug holes, and every day brought new enemy formations into the line. German staff officers were collecting patches, insignia, unit names, anything that helped them figure out who they were facing. And then reports start coming in about a British armored division marked by an all-seeing eye insignia. German intelligence dug into it and saw something that looked, on paper, almost funny. The name alone sounded like palace guards, ceremonial troops, units with long histories tied to tradition and state ceremony. Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Irish Guards, Welsh Guards. These weren't units German soldiers pictured as muddy, exhausted tank crews grinding through hedgerows. So a lot of Germans made the same mistake. They assumed the Guards were dress uniform soldiers who'd been thrown into armor late in the war. Basically, parade troops pretending to be tankers. That idea lasted until the Guards actually showed up. Normandy, the first shock. When the Guards' armored division entered the Normandy campaign, German observers started noticing a pattern right away. The Guards didn't move like most armored units. When tanks advance into danger, you usually expect speed and chaos, quick movement, sudden turns, crews trying to stay alive by being unpredictable. In close country like Normandy, you expect smoke, sprinting infantry, tanks darting between cover, and lots of frantic decisions. But German troops watching the Guards often described something that felt wrong. The Guards moved slowly and deliberately, not careless, not lazy, but controlled, like they were following a checklist. If they took fire, they didn't always do what Germans expected. They didn't panic. They didn't scatter. They didn't immediately race forward or whip around in a scramble. They'd stop, orient, bring guns on target, and respond with a calm, measured rhythm, as if they were running a drill. To a German soldier who lived through the Eastern Front's brutality or Normandy's chaos, that kind of steadiness didn't feel normal. It felt like they were being judged by an invisible instructor. German prisoners and frontline troops complained about it later in blunt terms. The Guards advanced like they were trying to do everything correctly, as if each movement mattered not just for survival, but for standards. And here's the kicker. The fighting itself wasn't even the main reason the dislike became hatred. It was what happened after the firing stopped. The behavior that drove Germans crazy. A lot of Allied troops, after a hard fight, looked like what they were. Men who just got through hell. They were covered in dust. They slumped. They ate whatever they could. They grabbed sleep when possible. In armored units, crews cleaned and repaired tanks, sure, but it was usually practical, rushed, and focused on keeping the machine alive. German troops kept noticing something different with the Guards. As soon as the immediate danger passed, Guardsmen snapped back into routine. They didn't just check equipment, they fussed over it. They cleaned, adjusted, straightened, and made everything look proper again. To Germans watching from positions nearby or hearing reports from other units, it came off like the Guards were performing a message: you cannot drag us down into the mud with you. There are also repeated wartime stories, some more solid than others, about Guards officers keeping their habits even close to combat. Tea being served when there was still smoke on the horizon, uniforms being kept neat, officers acting like the war was an interruption they'd manage with polite irritation. Now, to be fair, soldiers everywhere cling to routines under stress. It keeps you sane. But with the Guards, German troops didn't interpret it as coping. They interpreted it as showing off. And that's where the emotional heat started rising. The voices made it worse. Even before you see someone, you can hear them. And in war, radios spread personalities fast. German signals units monitored Allied traffic when they could. Prisoners were exchanged or moved. Frontline troops listened to each other's impressions. Little details traveled, and one detail kept coming up about Guards, officers, and NCOs, how they sounded. German troops were often working-class conscripts, men pulled from farms, workshops, factories, and small towns. They were used to hard language and blunt orders. Then they'd hear this clipped, polished British officer tone, controlled, polite, sometimes almost casual, not brave shouting, not panic, not rage, more like someone discussing an annoying task. Even when you strip away the exaggerations that pile up in wartime storytelling, the perception was real. Germans felt like the Guards spoke as though the fight itself was beneath them. And for a soldier who's cold, hungry, terrified, and bleeding, nothing lands like being treated as if you're an inconvenience. That's the kind of insult that digs in deep. Old rules, even when they made no sense. The Guards weren't just another unit with a good reputation. They were tied to regimental tradition, centuries of identity built around drill, discipline, and presentation. That culture did not vanish because artillery was falling. So Germans kept reporting things that sounded absurd in a combat zone. Men shaving when it seemed pointless. Uniform details being corrected before action. Small inspections and routines continuing, even when the front line was close enough to hear. Now, are all those stories perfectly documented the way people repeat them later? Not always. But here's what matters for understanding the hatred. Germans believed them. And belief shapes morale. To German troops, it felt like the Guards were broadcasting a message. No matter what you do, we will not become like you. That kind of emotional slap hits German pride in a very specific place, because the German army had its own deep traditions and its own sense of professionalism. So when the Guards acted like their tradition was untouchable, Germans didn't read it as discipline. They read it as judgment. The look-down effect. And yes, class played a role in how Germans interpreted this. The Guards had officers who came from elite backgrounds, and even when individual men weren't rich or aristocratic, the culture of the Guards had that reputation. It carried itself like a club, with rules you didn't get to question. German officers who were proud, who believed they belonged to a strong military system, found it hard to swallow being treated like a problem to be managed. Not an enemy worthy of emotion, not a rival, a mess on the carpet. That look-down sensation, whether it was always intended or not, turned regular battlefield anger into something more personal. And by late summer 1944, the emotion had spread. German units started dreading the idea of running into the Guards again. Not always because the Guards were unstoppable, but because dealing with them felt humiliating. Their methodical way of fighting made it worse. Most Allied armored formations had a style Germans could recognize. Some hit hard with massed fire and pressure. Some probed, pulled back, then punched where they found a weakness. Some were aggressive, some cautious. But even cautious units had a rhythm that Germans could predict. The Guards developed a pattern Germans found maddening. They didn't always rush. They'd see a defended position and pause. Not a panic pause, a deliberate stop. Then they'd build the solution. Infantry up, engineers ready, artillery brought in, coordination tightened. When possible, they'd stack advantages until the German position was already in trouble before the main attack even rolled. To German crews in anti-tank teams or dug-in infantry, it felt like being watched by a machine. You couldn't bait them easily. You couldn't rely on them making reckless mistakes. If you hit them, they didn't always explode into chaos. They simply adjusted, added more weight, and came again. German reports described it as slow and inevitable, like pressure you can delay, but not stop. And emotionally, that's brutal, because the normal morale trick in war is this: if we bloody them enough, they'll break. If we shock them enough, they'll lose confidence. The Guards didn't give Germans that satisfaction. No celebration, no drama. Just next task. Even when the Guards won, which they did often enough, their reaction didn't match what Germans expected from a victorious enemy. They didn't always act like men on an emotional high. They secured positions, set the perimeter, handled prisoners, and went right back into routine. Maintenance, order, structure. German prisoners later described feeling like they were a paperwork problem, not a hated enemy. And that clinical feeling was, in a weird way, worse than rage. Because rage means you matter. If someone hates you, you've gotten under their skin. You've affected them. But if someone treats you like a task they intend to finish correctly, then you're not even important enough to hate. That perception, fair or not, ate at German morale. The reputation shifts. By the time the summer battles were moving toward the liberation of major cities, German assessments of the Guards were changing. Early assumptions about ceremonial troops didn't survive contact with reality. German units began classifying them as a serious threat, not because of a secret weapon, but because their culture produced an unusual kind of steadiness. It was hard to disrupt, hard to intimidate, hard to shake, and that's where Part 1 ends. Because the next moment is where German frustration turns into something close to disbelief. September 1944 is coming. A major European city is about to be liberated. Crowds will flood the streets. And German soldiers watching the Guards roll in are going to see something that confirms every nasty thought they've built up. Because even when the world is cheering them as heroes, the Guards still can't stop being the Guards. And that is where the hatred really gets cemented. September 3rd, 1944. Brussels is about to be liberated. For the people in that city, it's a once-in-a-lifetime moment. 4 years of occupation, arrests, fear, shortages, the constant pressure of living under an enemy flag. When liberation finally comes, the emotions are going to spill into the streets, whether the liberating army likes it or not. And that's exactly what happens. Crowds surge out, people wave, they throw flowers, they run alongside the tanks, they climb onto vehicles, they offer drinks, they cheer like they can't stop themselves. If you've ever seen footage from liberated towns, you know the vibe. Raw relief, pure joy, and this desperate need to touch the moment and make it real. Now imagine being a German soldier falling back through that same city, ducking into doorways, hiding in upper floors, watching the enemy roll past. You'd expect the liberators to be beaming. But with the Guards' armored division, German observers kept noticing something that felt almost wrong. The Guards look bothered, not cruel, not heartless, just annoyed. Not because they don't understand what liberation means, but because the celebration is messing up the one thing the Guards treat like oxygen: order. People crowding the road ruins vehicle spacing. Civilians swarming tanks interrupts movement. Everyone stopping to cheer delays the timetable. To the Guards, Brussels isn't just a symbol, it's also a traffic problem. And to Germans watching, that detail was like fuel on a fire, because it confirmed what they already believed. These men don't fight like they're part of a dramatic war story. They fight like they're managing a job that needs to be done properly. German troops hiding in Brussels recorded the same kind of impression again and again. The British are being handed wine and flowers, and they accept politely. But you can tell they want the road cleared so they can keep moving. That's what made it sting. Most soldiers, especially in 1944, would soak up the moment. Even tough veterans get human when they see civilians crying and laughing because they're free. The Guards, by reputation and by behavior, didn't let the moment change them. And that unchanged look made German soldiers hate them more than if they'd been openly cruel. Because cruelty is emotional. Celebration is emotional. Anger is emotional. The Guards seem to be operating on something colder. Standards. Liberation, but keep your distance. There's a story that shows up in multiple retellings about this Brussels entry. Details vary depending on who's telling it, so keep it general. A Guards tank commander stops because civilians are blocking the way. Someone, often described as a young woman, tries to get close, maybe to kiss him or hug him in gratitude. The commander backs off and insists on proper distance. Whether that exact exchange happened word for word isn't the point. What matters is the consistent theme. The Guards are polite, even respectful, but firm about protocol. They do not melt into the crowd. They do not break formation. They do not let emotion rewrite the rulebook. German soldiers watching that scene didn't see discipline. They saw superiority. It looked like the Guards were saying, "Yes, thank you, very nice. Now please step aside so we can continue." And here's the part that really irritated German intelligence officers. Once Brussels is secured, the Guards don't linger. Most armies pause after a major prize. Units refit, rest, and let their soldiers breathe. It's normal. It's human. The Guards reorganize and push forward fast, as if Brussels is simply one checkpoint on a march that doesn't end until proper order is restored across Europe. German summaries in that period start describing something that's hard to measure, but easy to feel. Their tempo doesn't drop after success. Their morale doesn't swing wildly. They don't act drunk on victory. They just keep going. So German soldiers start asking themselves a question that sounds simple, but it hits deep. How do you deal with an enemy that doesn't react the way enemies are supposed to react? Because war is partly psychological. You look for signs. You watch faces. You listen to tone. You wait for the moment when the other side breaks, celebrates, panics, hesitates, mourns, anything that proves they're human and therefore predictable. The Guards weren't predictable like that. And then came the operation that German commanders believed would finally expose them. Market Garden. Now we'll break them. Late September 1944. Operation Market Garden. The concept is bold and dangerous. Airborne troops seize key bridges, while ground forces race up a narrow corridor to link up, cross the Rhine, and potentially crack Germany open faster than anyone thinks possible. On paper, it's high risk, high reward. In practice, it puts an armored spearhead, led by XXX Corps, with the Guards Armored Division right at the front, onto a single elevated road in the Netherlands, with soft ground on both sides that limits maneuver. That corridor becomes a funnel. German defenders don't need to guess what's coming. They can read the map. They can see the logic. They can prepare ambush points, choke points, kill zones. To many Germans, it looked like a gift. If you've been hearing about these polished boot tankers who advance like they're on a schedule, Market Garden seems like the perfect trap. One road, tight space, lots of places to hide anti-tank weapons, plenty of chances to cut the column and cause chaos. German units brace themselves, and when the Guards roll in, the early hits land. Anti-tank guns, artillery, handheld anti-tank weapons, anything that can stop a Sherman gets used. The front vehicles burn, the column bunches up. Smoke and confusion spread down the road. German commanders watch and wait for the moment they're certain will come. The Guards will pull back. They'll admit the plan is broken. They'll try something clever, or at least stop pushing. Except that's not what happens. The Guards do what German troops were starting to hate most. They pause, assess, and then continue. Methodically, they call up infantry to clear the roadside threats. Engineers come forward to deal with obstacles. Artillery starts working positions that reveal themselves. Tanks resume movement once the pressure is arranged correctly. To the Germans, it looks like the Guards are treating a deadly ambush like a delay on a timetable. That's why it was so infuriating. Not because the Guards were winning Market Garden. History shows the operation ultimately falls short at Arnhem. The maddening part was that the Guards didn't behave like men who realize it's falling apart. They behave like men who have been given a task, and the task will be carried out to the best of their ability, at the pace that keeps the machine functioning. German defenders describe the same loop repeating: hit them, stop the column, watch them freeze, then watch them calmly rebuild the push, more infantry, more fire support, more tanks, and grind the position down. To German soldiers who hoped to create panic, it was like trying to scare a door. The no drama effect in a disaster. Here is the strange truth. Market Garden becomes a mess, but the Guards' behavior still feels consistent. They don't suddenly become a different unit because the operation is struggling. They don't switch into wild improvisation. They don't lose their identity. German troops expected frustration. They expected anger. They expected the British to curse the plan, throw caution away, and rush. Instead, the Guards keep moving like a machine that doesn't care about your feelings. And if you're a German soldier defending a hedgerow or a village or a crossroads, you don't experience that as professional. You experience it as insulting because you are risking your life for every meter. Your friends are dying. Your nerves are fried. Your hands shake when you reload. And the enemy looks like he's handling you the same way he handles a paperwork pile. That's where the hatred deepens. A German unit can respect a fierce attacker. They can even respect a clever one. They can understand an enemy that is scared but brave anyway. But the Guards gave them something else. The sense that the German army was not a rival, just a problem to be corrected. The losses that should have shattered them. Along that corridor, the Guards take losses. Vehicles burn, crews die, columns get hit again and again. Any armored unit can be battered by repeated ambushes in confined terrain, and many units, no matter how brave, would start showing cracks, hesitation, fear, the creeping sense of doom. The Guards, according to the way German veterans remembered them, didn't show those cracks in a satisfying way. They absorbed the damage, adjusted the method, and resumed the push. Their reactions stayed controlled. Their tone stayed clinical. German soldiers began to realize something unpleasant. You can delay these men. You can hurt them. You can even stop them for a time, but it's hard to make them quit. And then, when the operation collapses at the far end, when the objective at Arnhem cannot be secured, and the plan's grand promise fails, German troops expected the Guards' attitude to finally change. This is when they should look shaken. When they should look humbled. Instead, the Guards reorganize and return to operations with the same calm confidence. To German soldiers who had poured blood into every kilometer of that road, that indifference was unbearable. It felt like the Germans paid the full price, and the Guards barely reacted. And that's the exact emotional trigger that turns frustration into lasting bitterness. The feeling that your suffering didn't even register. Impossible didn't seem to translate. What the Germans discovered wasn't that the Guards were flawless. It was that the Guards had a different relationship with the idea of impossible. Many soldiers learn over time to recognize situations where the cost is too high, where you need a new approach, where you need to rethink the entire plan. That's not cowardice. That's survival. With the Guards, German troops kept describing a stubbornness that looked almost like they couldn't process the concept. If the order is advance, then advance is what happens, step by step, cleaned up and organized. If the order is hold, then hold is what happens, no matter how miserable. That quality is not brilliance. It's not genius. It's commitment, identity, a refusal to let circumstances bend the regiment. And in war, that can be terrifying, not because it's dramatic, but because it's steady. The most personal insult was still coming. By late 1944, German soldiers had started making dark jokes about the Guards. Jokes are what troops use when something bothers them too much to talk about directly. Humor is armor. They joked that the British would schedule violence politely. They joked that surrendering to the Guards felt like being graded. They joked that the Guards didn't hate them because hate required emotion, and the Guards didn't seem to give them the honor of emotion. Those jokes sound like comedy, but they're really frustration, because every other enemy relationship in war has some emotional logic. Even if it's ugly, it makes sense. But the Guards felt like an enemy that didn't treat you as equal in the basic human way. And that's why German soldiers kept saying, after the fact, that they'd rather face other Allied armored formations than deal with the Guards again. Not because the Guards were always the deadliest unit on the map, because fighting them made you feel small. And now we reach the moment that German veterans described as the final mental breaking point, something that isn't a huge battle, not a major defeat, not a dramatic collapse. It's something smaller, and because it's smaller, it gets under the skin even deeper. The Guards have a tradition for their fallen officers, a full, formal memorial, ceremony, formation, and proper respect. And they carried that tradition into combat zones, even when shells were falling close enough to make it seem insane. German troops watched these ceremonies from positions not far away and couldn't understand what they were seeing. An enemy unit so committed to form that it would stand at attention, conduct rituals, and keep standards intact while war kept moving around them, not as a break from duty, as part of duty. To German soldiers, it looked like something beyond normal bravery, more like an obsession with order that artillery couldn't shake. And when you face an enemy like that, one conclusion starts to form in your mind. You can kill them. You can damage their tanks. You can even stop an operation, but you cannot make them become anything other than what they are. In Part 3, that mindset follows the Guards all the way into Germany itself, right into the final months of the war, where German surrender, defeat, and even the end of 6 years of fighting are handled by the Guards with the same chilly administrative calm. And that's when the Germans finally understand why they hated them so much. It wasn't the Guards' firepower. It was the feeling of being dismissed. By late 1944, the war in Western Europe is changing shape. Germany is under pressure from every direction. The front lines grind forward, towns fall, defensive lines break, and units that once felt unstoppable are now stretched thin, patching holes with exhausted men and rushed formations. In that kind of situation, soldiers cling to anything that makes the world feel normal. For German troops, normal meant surviving one more day, holding one more crossroads, and hoping the next unit they face isn't the one that crushes them. But when the enemy in front of you is the Guards' armored division, normal becomes something else. Because the Guards don't just fight you. They make you feel like you're being processed. The ceremony that rattled German nerves, German soldiers had already learned to expect the Guards to behave strangely under pressure. Shaving, inspections, the rigid posture, the way they carried themselves even in mud and smoke. But one tradition hit Germans harder than almost anything else because it happened right in their line of sight and made no tactical sense to them. When Guards officers were killed, the regiment believed proper respect wasn't optional. They held memorial services with full formality, orderly formation, ceremony, and military dignity, and they didn't always wait until it was safe. German troops positioned close enough to observe through binoculars wrote later about seeing Guards units form up and conduct these services while shells were landing nearby, even when the front was active, even when the battlefield still felt unfinished. Now, important point, the exact details of what each German soldier claimed to see can't always be confirmed down to the meter or the minute. War stories get polished in memory, but the overall pattern is solid. The Guards were known for ritual and discipline, and Germans consistently remembered these ceremonies as proof that something about the Guards was different. To German troops, it looked unreal, because in the German army, you mourn when you can. You honor the dead when time allows. You don't put men in formation in a combat zone if you can avoid it. The Guards did it anyway. And the part that made it worse was that the Guards didn't treat the ceremony as a pause from combat. The war kept moving. Patrols still ran. Tanks still worked. Fire missions still happened. The ceremony existed alongside battle, like it was simply another item that had to be done correctly. German soldiers couldn't fit that into their worldview. They weren't watching bravery the way Hollywood sells bravery. They were watching a unit so committed to form that danger didn't override it. That commitment was deeply unsettling because it suggested something the Germans didn't want to admit. You can't intimidate an enemy that doesn't react emotionally. Dark jokes, real bitterness. By that stage, German units started coping the way soldiers always cope, through bitter humor. They joked that the British would schedule their killing politely. They joked that the Guards wouldn't shoot during tea time. They joked that if you surrendered, you'd better not look sloppy because the Guards would judge you for it. The jokes sound funny on the surface, but they point to a real emotion underneath, humiliation, because the Guards, in German eyes, weren't fighting with hatred. And in a twisted way, German soldiers wanted hatred. Hatred at least meant the enemy saw you as a threat worth emotion. The Guards' clean, controlled attitude made Germans feel like they weren't even being granted the dignity of being a true rival. Not heroic, not evil, not feared, just handled. The Guards' problem-solving style. By now, German commanders had adjusted their formal assessments. The early idea that the Guards were parade troops was gone. The Guards were now considered a serious formation, dangerous not because of unique equipment, but because of reliability and coordination. And that's the most frustrating kind of enemy. A wild, reckless unit might break if you hit it hard enough. A flashy unit might make mistakes. A unit driven by adrenaline might overextend. But a methodical unit that treats war like a professional task, that's harder to shake. German after-action reports and veteran memories describe the Guards as an advancing machine with a steady rhythm. They identify a defensive knot. They stop. They assemble the correct tools: infantry, artillery, engineers, sometimes air support when available. Then they apply that force until the defense collapses. Then they move on without drama. The Germans kept describing this as the Guards solving positions rather than fighting them. And emotionally, that mattered, because if you think you're fighting, then courage and sacrifice are part of the story. If the enemy treats you like a problem, then your courage feels wasted. Your sacrifice feels unseen. That's what made German morale crack in little pieces over time. Winning without celebrating. Then you get to one of the most revealing parts of this whole story: how the Guards handled victory. Across late 1944 and into 1945, German forces are steadily pushed back. Town after town, road after road, defensive line after defensive line. Some Allied units celebrated hard-won gains. Some soldiers laughed, shouted, slapped each other's backs, or grabbed souvenirs. That's normal. It's human. German prisoners often noticed that the Guards didn't do that in the same way. They didn't treat victory like a party. They treated victory like the expected outcome of correct procedure. Secure the position, set security, process prisoners, maintain equipment, restore order. This made German soldiers feel like surrendering to the Guards wasn't an emotional end to combat. It was an administrative event. And when you've been fighting for years, when your entire life has been reduced to survival, that kind of cold ending feels like an insult. The surrender problem. They didn't even look relieved. By 1945, German units are collapsing in many areas. Some are still fighting hard, but many are shattered, exhausted, and out of options. When German soldiers surrendered to Americans, survivors often recalled small moments of shared humanity. Cigarettes, gestures, the sense of, it's over. Not always, not everywhere, but it happened. When Germans surrendered to the Guards, the memory that shows up again and again is different. Guards officers accepted surrender formally. Instructions were given. Men were directed where to stand, what to do, how to behave. Paperwork and procedures followed. Guards' discipline extended into captivity. From the German side, it felt like being processed by a system that didn't care about your story. A man could have fought for years, lost friends, done terrible things, suffered, nearly died. And the Guards officer receiving the surrender might act like he was receiving a delivery: neutral expression, polite tone, no visible triumph, no visible relief. That's what German veterans couldn't shake decades later. Not the fear, the dismissal. The final phase. No rush for glory. As the Third Reich fell apart, something else happened. Allied armies were racing. There was prestige in being first to certain cities, first to major objectives, first to the final line. War brings out competition even among allies. German soldiers sensed that urgency from many units. Because urgency is loud, you can feel it in how a formation moves. But with the Guards, German veterans kept describing the same steady pace. No dramatic sprint for headlines, no chaotic final push energy, just the same methodical advance they'd shown since Normandy. That consistency turned their reputation into something almost mythic for the Germans who survived them. The Guards weren't driven by rage. They weren't driven by fear. They weren't driven by desperation. They were driven by identity. And identity doesn't change because you're near the finish line. Why the hatred lasted after the war. After 1945, German veterans talked. They compared notes. They argued about who was toughest, who was most dangerous, who was most humane, who was most brutal. The Guards kept coming up, not necessarily as the strongest enemy, but as the most irritating. Because the Guards made Germans feel small without even trying. They didn't need to scream. They didn't need propaganda. They didn't need cruelty. They didn't even need to hate. They just acted like German resistance was a nuisance interrupting proper business. And that's a special kind of wound to pride. You can respect an enemy who fears you. You can understand an enemy who hates you. You can even forgive an enemy who beats you. But an enemy who treats you like a traffic jam, like something clogging up the schedule, that sticks. The deeper clash, two military cultures colliding. If you zoom out, the reason this story works isn't because the Guards were magical or invincible. It's because two military cultures collided. German military culture, especially as many soldiers understood it, put heavy weight on struggle, endurance, sacrifice, and proving yourself through hardship. In their minds, war was a test of who could suffer more, who could push further, who could outlast. Then they ran into a British unit that treated war like professional administration. Not easy, not fun, but organized. The Guards' traditions were older than the war. Their regimental identity came from centuries of rules about dress, conduct, ceremony, and discipline. So when Germans tried to drag them into the emotional mud, fear, panic, hatred, desperation, the Guards often didn't respond the way Germans expected. They didn't become like them. They stayed Guards. And to Germans, that felt like the Guards were saying, "You are not important enough to change us." That message, more than any single battle, is what drove the hatred. Because for a German soldier fighting for survival, being told, without words, that your entire war is a temporary inconvenience to someone else's standards is almost unbearable. It's not just defeat, it's dismissal. The real weapon, indifference backed by confidence. Here's the final point that explains why the Guards' Armored Division lived rent-free in German memories. The Guards' most effective psychological weapon wasn't their guns. It was their indifference. Not indifference as in they didn't care about their own men. They did. Indifference as in they didn't care about German pride. They didn't seem emotionally invested in the idea of Germans as a grand enemy. They treated the German army as a problem to eliminate efficiently, then move on from without giving it the honor of a dramatic emotional reaction. And for German veterans looking back, that was the hardest part to forgive. The Guards didn't win German respect because they never chased it. They didn't need German fear because they didn't feed on fear. They didn't need hatred because standards were enough. And in the end, the Germans didn't remember the Guards as monsters. They remembered them as something more irritating. A unit that fought a world war like it was a disciplined routine, correctly done, neatly finished, filed away. If you want more WWII stories that dig into the human side of how armies really clashed, subscribe and hit the bell, because the next video goes straight into another case where the enemy wasn't hated for what they did, but for what they made the other side feel.